con la
Good
parte
afternoon,
tecnica.
everybody. We should be set by
Grazie,
now with our
benvenuti alla
technical
Design
equipment.
Museum,
Thank you,
giornata
and
per
welcome to
noi
the
estremamente
ADI Design Museum.
importante
Now, this is a very
e
important
siamo
day for
particolarmente
us,
onorati di
and it is a
accogliere
special
Norman
honor
Foster,
for us
Tecno,
to welcome here
a
Norman
raccontare
Foster,
questa sua
Techno,
esperienza.
to
Norman Foster
share
è
his experience.
autorevole compasso d'oro
Norman
nel
Foster was awarded
1987
the prestigious
con
Compasso d'Oro Award in
Nomos, un
1987
progetto che
with
ha cambiato
Novos,
completamente
a
lo
project that has
scenario
completely
del mondo
changed
ufficio
the scenario of
e
the
quindi
office
oggi
furnishing world.
ascoltiamo invece questa
So
nuova
today we will listen to this new
esperienza. Siamo
experience instead.
veramente
We
onorati
are
di avervi
truly
oggi. Non
honored
rubo altro
to have
tempo,
you here
lascerei
today,
la
and I will
parola
not take
a
up
Giuliano
any more
Mosconi
time, and I will leave the floor
per
to
introdurci
Giuliano
l'argomento.
Mosconi
Grazie.
to introduce us to the subject. Thank you. It's a very long story, very long. And I didn't live it alone, though, because we found ourselves working on the Techno deal about 10 years ago. But we have basically tried to maintain the original spirit of this company, which, as you know, after 30 years of work with wood products, in 1953 decided to call itself Techno. And this was objectively a manifesto of its business. We've always dealt with the workplaces, focusing on the objects that are present in workplaces, and also on how these objects may substantially change in connection with technology. Well, I believe it was in the early 80s. And by the way, with someone I happened to meet in another experience, who was Robert Tamosci, who put in touch the techno of the time with the Foster studio, basically for this product, for this idea. That is, to find out how to replace or to integrate Graphis, which was one of the first products that came out of the single desk to go towards the virtual bench. And by the way, at that time, computers were literally flooding the tables, the desks, the worktops. And there couldn't be basically anything but an architect who had the intuition to think of a desk with multiple layers. It is simply a very strong architectural idea. It is a product that was eventually awarded the Compasso d'Oro, as you said, and which has certainly disrupted our way of doing things. We kept doing things beyond projects, even very large projects around the world. Let's say the latest somewhat important experience was the Vatican Chapel in Venice, where to some extent we tried to explain what a chapel is about. And so this was objectively a common and very beautiful work. Even imagining that a chapel can be basically supported and held just like a sailing boat. Well, again, that was an amazing intuition. And today we're here with an equally amazing idea, like they say these days, sustainable, where finished objects, when assembled together, may result in a very important product. I think we went from 48 pieces of Nomos to about 10 pieces, just to say that sustainability means quality and doing things with just a few items. Norman, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm afraid Norman and I will be speaking in fluent English today. I guess we both had a long association with Milan, and this is a sentence I never thought I would speak. Norman has followed in my footsteps to become the editor of Domus. So congratulations on that, Norman, something I was doing 25 years ago. I also well remember the launch of Nomus, which won the Compassa d'Oro, and the metaphor you used then was of a Swiss Army penknife, something that could do so much. But the starting point for this table, which is a research project, ultimately, was a bicycle. And the bicycle, of course, has a very rich part to play in the heritage of furniture design. In 1924, Marcel Breuer was riding his Adler bicycle around the streets of Dessau, and you've been riding bicycles since you were even younger than that. But this began life when you were looking at your carbon fiber bicycle. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I'd completely forgotten the extraordinary connection between a whole generation of modern furniture, which was rooted in the bicycle. All the tubular chairs, which every architect of a certain period seemed to produce. Yes, the carbon fiber, lightweight, high performance, incredibly strong bicycle frame, which with its tapering lugs and so on, is a point of reference, a point of inspiration. And it's no accident that the first prototype for this system, and I'd come back to the word system afterwards, because I think that's one of the unifying things that brought us together with Techno right back in the 1980s, was the idea that you could create an individual object, but that it was part of a wider system. It wasn't just a one-off. And that systems thinking, I think, is very much rooted in the 1960s and as relevant today as it was then. Freedom, which is a consultancy to Airbus, produced the first prototype in carbon fiber. Then the second one was in steel, and the eventual transition from prototyping to a final product emerges as an aluminium fabrication. I could talk at length about that, but maybe...
I mean, it's... there is a sort of tension between architecture and furniture design. Both sides sort of admire each other and tiptoe closely towards each other, not always with great results. But you've been designing furniture since your studio in London in the 70s, for your own use initially and then for other people.
No, I think it goes back further. It goes back to the earlier practice of Team 4, the Reliance Controls Factory, the design of the reception desk there, that's the 1966, 67. Yes, I've described in the past that furniture is almost like architecture in microcosm, because you're dealing with all the forces of gravity, of loads, strength. You're pursuing, if you like, a mantra of seeking to do more with less. And eventually, you can describe it in, I can talk about the strength to weight ratio, I can talk about the load of 400 kilos that this would sustain. I could say it's only 20 kilos in weight. And it's right down, but in the end, it's also the pursuit of the beautiful object, or the beautiful accumulation of elements, coming back to the idea of the system and the fact that you can, out of these standard components, you can create an infinite variety of configurations. So, yes, there is a continuity over time.
And this is the product not of your main office, but your research practice. And I just wonder if you might talk a little bit about what the research practices are trying to achieve and how it works.
Well, it comes down to the foundation. The foundation which was created in the late 1990s, London-based with scholarships ongoing, American friends. And then in 2017, we launched the Global Foundation with its headquarters in Madrid. And that is very much about a multidisciplinary approach to the issues of urbanization. It has an educational program. It's about the civic leaders of the future. And in the same way that at the moment a master's course on sustainable cities combines the best of academia with hands-on experience. And in a way, this round table is highly symbolic. It's non-hierarchical. It's about bringing different skills to bear, pooling knowledge. And that is as relevant to the civic leaders of the future, tackling climate change, all the issues of urbanization, or whether it is the research into, in this case, a furniture system, the principles of combining different skills and in a way empowering those who design with greater knowledge. In this case, the fusion of the manufacturing, the industrialization with the idea of the concept, and really pooling knowledge and expertise.
The table's got a long symbolic history for you. You like to use it as a symbol of that collaboration. And I guess when you started your studio as well, it was a place which was not only architects that you worked with. There's that famous photograph of you and Buckminster Fuller in your studio with an engineer, Tony Hunt, a furniture designer, a graphic designer, and you as the architect. And that's a very unusual but powerful form of practice.
Yes, I think that idea of being empowered as a designer by access to more knowledge and in a way turning the conventional model, which is taught in a design school, where the designer designs and then, as it were, hands it, in the case of architecture, to an engineer to make it stand up, to make it warm when it's cold outside, the environmental, the structural engineering. If you, instead of that being a linear process, so the table is symbolic of all those skills, pooling their expertise right at the beginning. And if this is architecture in miniature, then it's the process in miniature. It's the ability to go to a certain point, prototyping, learning from that process, learning from the experts in the materials, whether they're applying those materials to the design of aircraft, and then pooling that knowledge and working together through the process of industrialization. And I think the advantage of this approach is that it's a shared creativity. You have to share the same values for that to work as a process, but then you don't lose the, how can I say, you don't lose aspects of the design which in a traditional process get watered down, get diluted through that process, but rather the other way round. If you have a shared idealism, then you can refine even further.
And making this happen was very much the role of Techno and their factory. I mean, I mean, you worked together to produce this version from your prototypes.
Yes, Diego Tobolino is here. He was the key individual in the foundation. We worked together. He worked with Techno. The three of us worked together. I think we can talk about the relatively small number of components. We can talk about the extraordinary strength, the slenderness. But in the end, it's very difficult to say who finally was responsible for which component, the way that they slot together. At the risk of repetition, I think the really exciting thing is that once you have that that catalogue of components, then you have the possibility of personalizing that. And so if you can personalize that at scale for the workplace or a university, or the individual object, and the range of colors, the range of glasses, the range of woods. So it's that aspect of using the mass production of an industrial process, but enabling the individual, whether that's a family, a single individual, or whether it's an enterprise, to be able to customize the end product.
You mentioned that this is part of a system. How do you envisage it being used?
I think that's entirely up to the market, and that, I think, is the exciting thing about that. You cannot predetermine it. I mean, if I was going to say we're going to fit out our foundation throughout with this, then I would have, together with the team, shared ideas on that. But then another enterprise with another way of working. Some enterprises are compartmentalized, others are open plan. I think that's the exciting thing. You can't really predetermine it. You can make some suggestions to inspire possibilities.
But there's a shelving system that is also part of it?
Yes, it's not just work surfaces. It's verticality in terms of bookcases, displays. And once you talk about display, it could be the books in your library, it could be the clothes in a fashion house. The possibilities are truly infinite.
At what stage did it take shape in your mind? I mean, you saw the bicycle, it triggered off a train of thought, and then what happened?
Well, I'm forever sketching, and I think you can, up to a certain point, before others come in and start to interact with the ideas. We were talking just briefly over lunch about one interpretation of this, and I was saying that in the foundation, with the galleries of projects and models, a curator, who's a very distinguished architectural critic, came up with the categorization of skin and bones. So what he was saying is, if I look at all the projects that you and your colleagues have touched, they fall into two categories. One is the bones, and that's the expression of the structure. So the Hong Kong Bank, for example, is very expressive of its structure. The other is skin, and that's the smooth skin. And if I could give examples of that, Sainsbury Centre, for example. And I can apply that categorization to the streamlined car, which is the skin, or the Jeep, or an early automobile where everything is expressed, the mudguards, the headlights, and so on. So as a categorization, it works across the whole field of design. And Nomos is really very much the bones. You have the spine, you have the separate legs, you have the triangulation, the separate elements, each with their own identity. This is perhaps the equivalent of the skin. It's attenuated, so it's just one language throughout. It's much more streamlined, and in a way the two worlds exist in parallel, as indeed Nomos and Cosmos exist in parallel.
But this has really reduced things to their absolute essence. It couldn't be refined anymore. It would fall over if you took any more material away.
Well, I'm reminded, and I'm trying to remember, Paul McCready created as an aircraft designer the first pedestrian-powered flight, and then the first solar-powered flight. And his design process was very simple. He'd keep reducing the aircraft to the next stage of paring it away. And at the point where it structurally collapsed, that was it. That was where he stopped and went one notch up. And I think that if I applied the Macready principle to this, if you tried to refine it further, it would fall on the floor, under load.
It is fascinating. I mean, Charles Eames apparently used to say that the last thing he did was to start off thinking how something would look. You start with what it's going to do, and then the looks sort of take care of themselves, which I think is true for Charles Eames and maybe for your studio, but not for everybody.
I think Buckminster Fuller, with whom I collaborated for the last 12 years of his life, put it another way, and he said, I never think of trying to design something beautiful, but if at the end of the process it doesn't end up being beautiful, then I've failed. So I think however you come at it, whether it's in the subconscious, whether it evolves out of the pursuit of paring something away, refining it, trying to bring it down to its essence. And I think that the test of a design, and I'm not trying to categorize that, but if I think of classic designs, they have somehow endured over time, and they have often been a process of that same refinement. So if I dissociate the idea of a Spitfire from World War II as being a killing machine, and if I can divorce that from its intent and just see it as an object, and I think of those extraordinarily beautiful elliptical wings, I think that I've always been suspicious of categorization between the world of so-called fine art, of painting, sculpture, of the design of everyday objects, of architecture. I think there are far more common denominators between these different disciplines. And if you look back over time, then I think there's a certain cultural continuity between these different worlds.
I think with furniture, it's maybe partly because technology doesn't change quite so fast. If you think about the other things that were being launched in 1987 around the time of Nomos, and think about how many of them still feel visually relevant, think about what a telephone was like then, or a car, or an aircraft even. And there's a different time scale in furniture. And yet this is also obviously clearly also in many ways an evolution of Nomos.
I think it's also a reflection on the research element of design. So what we've taken for granted in terms of using a CNC machine to mill a leg out of the solid, that was a kind of esoteric wonder, a kind of almost like the early use of computers. They were almost religious objects which would be encased in their own buildings like a chapel. Now they've, through scale, permeated and become everyday objects. And so the ability to mass produce using CNC shaping here, together with the use of a horizontal element, which is an extrusion, and to fuse those two together with a small use of steel. So it is taking advantage of advances in manufacturing capability.
You could not have made this in 1987.
No, you could have probably made it as a sculptural one-off, but you couldn't have done it as a mass-produced item.
I think one of the other appealing things about furniture is it does also give us a kind of sense of materiality. You know, the world is becoming more and more on screens, and we're losing so many objects, and tables are simple, humble things which still mean so much.
Well, I think it's, if you take the analogy of architecture, it's the point of human contact. So the furniture, it's no accident that a door handle is called door furniture or ironmongery, but it's the point at which you engage. And I've always been fascinated by those architects from the past who've inspired me. And I always remember my first visit to a building by Alvar Aalto, and the door handle was totally customized. And I remember also visiting a cathedral, and the door handle was bird-like, inspired by the shape of a bird. And those points of contact are memorable. And furniture, of course, we're literally here at the point of contact. So yes, it's important.
I was talking earlier about the research starting point for this, which was materials. And I'm not sure I put the question quite rightly, because I was also thinking about the kind of research into working practices and how the office has moved on. I mean, I remember you had probably the first Action Office 2 in London in your studio in the early days, and then the Nomos working system was for a very different one. Is that kind of something that your research activities are thinking about?
Well, there is a lineage which you identify. We moved studios in 1980, and I remember that we needed a table for meetings. We needed a drawing stand to be able to draw. We needed a display platform to be able to show models. We needed screens. And so I remember at that time working with one individual, and we conceived a system that would, with interchangeable parts, would answer all those needs. And we did that for ourselves. And we were doing a building for Renault at the time in the West Country, which was a combination warehouse, showroom, offices. And they saw what we'd done, and they said, we'd love something like that to fit out our new building. So that was developed, and it was at that point that, as you said, that Robert Timoshy saw it, and that was how the collaboration started with Techno. So I think that it's very difficult to categorize that process. It would have been so much easier, perhaps, moving studios at that time to have bought X number of tables from one manufacturer, drawing stands from another, cobbled some things up. So I think it's that process of questioning and saying, why isn't there something on the market that answers all those needs? I mean, here, why isn't there something perhaps on the market which could produce something for the dining room, but at the same time, the investment in the industrialization and the idea that it could have a far wider application. I think that's what's really exciting, because right now, none of us knows really where this will end up. We just know it has infinite possibilities.
It's an exciting time for it. Your studio is actually working on a whole range of other non-architectural projects, isn't it? From, well, door handles to seating, to chairs, to cutlery, to lights. How does that work in the mainstream studio? You have a department, or it's?
There's a small group which I interact with. I mean, I think there are certain things which you can do in a practice, and that is one of my three worlds. My other world is with the United Nations as advocate for the Forum of Mayors, where I bring mayors from North America, Asia, and Europe to pool experience and encourage them to bring forth sustainable initiatives. The third world is, as we have here, is the foundation, and that is rooted in research, it's rooted in education, and it's, for the most part, almost entirely doing, and they're all separate, doing the kind of things that it would be inconceivable to do in practice. And so we funded the research in the materials, but the materials have converged into a furniture element. They wouldn't necessarily have gone that way. They could have merged, they could have morphed into something else. I'll give you another example of something which it would be impossible to do really in practice, and that was, there was a workshop in the foundation on the refugee crisis, and 10 scholars from around the world engaged with, in a week-long workshop with 10 mentors, worldwide experts. And we plugged into the world of refugees and discovered that you were issued with a tent, and a tent has a one-year life, but there's an extraordinary tent which emerged out of an enterprise and is more sophisticated. I think it has a life of about 3 years, but essentially it's a piece of cloth. I mean, it might be synthetic, it might be canvas, whatever. And you realize statistically that the average time a refugee will spend in a refugee camp is 17 years. So the students, scholars quite rightly, were challenging this and saying, why can't you build something durable, permanent, but doesn't take years? Why can't you do something in a few days as opposed to, say, the 16 hours to erect a tent? And that was the year before last, and that was in June. And in August, the sponsor for that workshop came to the group in the foundation and said, that was a fantastic proposition. Could you demonstrate it in time for the Venice Biennale, which was last year? And we did that. And we took a material, and again, it comes into this material research. And we discovered a material that had never been used for buildings. And it's a canvas which is impregnated with low-carbon cement. And when you spray it with water, in a few hours, it goes hard. 24 hours, it's structurally rigid. So we demonstrated you could drape that over a lightweight formwork as an arch. You could harden it, take away the formwork. You've got a beautiful arch. You could insulate it, and you could flat pack an installation. And so that was demonstrated last year. Everybody who saw it didn't think this is a kind of reach-me-down refugee, upmarket equivalent of a tent. Everybody loved it. They said, I'd like to spend the night in it. I'd like one at the bottom of my garden. And so a government from South America saw that and saw its application in terms of affordable housing. The end result is that we're working right now on prototyping, and we aim to deliver, using that technology, that material technology, we aim to deliver a home, 2 bedrooms, kitchen, living room, outdoor space for $16,000 at scale. So in a way, just like the sustainable course on cities, which is combining academia with practice, here the foundation is exploring many of the things that would be impossible in a commercial private practice.
And I guess that's the power of research. It's the power to self-initiate something without the constraints of a brief. Obviously, a brief can be a fantastic starting point, but not always.
Yes, I mean, the story about its actual term now is essential housing, although it started off as, as, if you like, a research project with scholars on the refugee crisis and how you produced something very, very quickly. But then when that research touches the hard economic realities, and the parallels, I guess, here is that you have the vision of a very, very refined element, which you've demonstrated at a certain point, but you put it to the challenge of making it affordable at scale. And the same thing, whether it's true of a small object like this, or a small house, and the small house then becomes part of a much larger community. It's the same process. It's hitting the economic realities. And I think the common denominator here is that, and maybe in more personal terms, it comes back to the educators who influenced you when you were a student. And I was fortunate in that I had two key individuals at a Yale master's class. And one was, interestingly, European, Serge Chemaev, Russian actually by background. And if you'd been working on a design and he came round to your drawing board to crit you, he wouldn't be interested in looking at what you were doing. He'd want to talk about why and challenge the whole sort of intellectual pursuit. And Paul Rudolph, who was the dean of the school, there was no conversation about the philosophy behind the project. It was, you know, show me the drawings, show me the model. It was the action man. This was somebody who was passionate about architecture and was going to build. And somehow, how do you combine those two aspects, the curiosity, the challenge, the questioning, and at the same time, root it in action? I think it's a continuous challenge.
And Chemaev, was it fascinated in how people lived and density of housing, whereas Rudolph made beautiful buildings?
Yes, and Chemaev did a book called Community and Privacy, co-authored with Christopher Alexander. And that was a very powerful manifesto demonstrating, and in a way, as more I think about it, the course on sustainable cities is about the importance of the compact, walkable, sustainable, friendly city as opposed to the car-borne, sprawling city. And in Microcosm, Chemaev was about that in terms of the dwellings, championing the idea that you could live quite densely. The word sustainability wasn't in circulation at that time, but certainly sustainable, with a very high degree of privacy. And in that 50s, 60s, I think, Atelier 5 did Siedlung Harlem in just outside of Bern as a demonstration of a row house set in the countryside with extraordinary privacy, notwithstanding proximity. So the themes kind of linked together over time at different scales.
There was obviously something in the atmosphere in Yale at that time. I mean, the idea of Christopher Alexander, Serge Chemaev, and you in the same room together is something to speculate about. He went off to write the famous systems books and The City is Not a Tree, and it took a very different but interesting line.
Well, if I talk about the influence of two individuals, one the all-American action man, the other the European questioning intellectual, then there was a third individual, Vincent Scully. And Scully brought history alive and well, brought it from the past fused the poets, the writers, the sculptors, the architects, and could mix in one extraordinary lecture the sighting of the Parthenon to Dylan Thomas, to the endless American horizon, and what Eero Saarinen was doing down the road in his studio, and link that to the film, the local cinema. So, and I think that history is critically important, and it's not the ritual of learning dates and names, but it's truly a creative force. I'm a little something of a cliche, but I've said and kind of demonstrated through a whole series of projects, and that is, if you really want to look far ahead into the future, then first look far back to the past. The lessons are invariably there.
Scully was an amazing figure. He was famous, wasn't he, for multiple slide projectors, carousel slide projectors, and also he had an ability to keep on talking even if he fell off the stage in a moment of enthusiasm.
Well, he did fall off the stage on one occasion. He got so carried away. He was, somebody once described him as a great actor. I think that he was, in many ways like Rudolph, passionate about the subject. And I think that's a really important common denominator across any profession, any skill, the passion of the individual. And I've become, as an architect, involved with colleagues in the whole design of hospitals and specialist units, heart unit in Cairo, Mayo Clinic, children's hospitals. And behind these ventures, there's always somebody who really lives with a passion that subject. I mean, I had a meeting 2 weeks ago with a surgeon whose speciality is separating twins, and we're doing it's a charitable project. I mean, he has a charity which is behind the project, and it's that same intense passion. I mean, all these individuals, whatever their background, whatever their mission, I mean, they live that reality.
And you could say, going back to our hosts today, that Techno is a firm which has had a passion about making stuff beautifully. Perhaps, ultimo parola del Techno.
Well, it started with two twins. I mean, the Borsani twins. And one was a brilliant designer and the other was a brilliant accountant. So what more could you ask? You're running out of questions.
I'm running out of questions, yes. And I'm not very good at framing them in Italian, but maybe if the translator can do this for your benefit, it would be good to get some response from Techno to what Norman has been saying.
Well, I can, let's say, without going into these very interesting elements of architecture, very, very well defined, I can simply tell you about these years in which we have worked a bit together. The obsession with details, the obsession with drawing. I think it got a little lost in the development of new products, maybe because of computers, maybe because there are systems that surpass it, but trying to capture the detail, redesigning it, remaking the prototype, redesigning again, remaking the prototype means achieving a fairly important element of perfection. You may have noticed that we started off from a project that was made of carbon. Then we got to a structure made of steel, made of tapered steel. To give strength in these especially minimalistic dimensions, there has been a sort of hardening to give strength to the structure. And this is already a first essential element, I believe. As we said at the start, it is a system, and I think it's a system the way it turned out for Nomos, and the same will happen to Cosmos. This is bound to happen and will probably not be true only for workplaces. So let's say there is a possibility of moving in bigger, larger spaces. There is an important focus, I think, on what communication objects are. The table will definitely remain one of the key elements for this type of activity. We made the bookcases, and it looks like books are only digital, but it's not like that. We are back to appreciating the physical structure of books. So we're now working on this kind of concept. Then another element of Techno, I think, is equally important, is that the logo was drawn with a caliper, because the caliper has an element of perfection. And another thing that unites us is that all Techno products have a Latin name. Now, this is another, let's say, element that distinguishes us, carrying and looking at the historical side of this story, the beauty, the clarity, the architecture. To some extent, it meant that all of our products continued to be written in Latin. And one last comment, and then you will all get the chance of seeing them. It is not a prototype, it's become a fully developed product. So one of our booths in Piazza 25 Aprile has been fully dedicated to Cosmos, where we can see all the shape situations, all the various combinations.
So I think we should say thank you. It's getting warm. There's a chance to see the system being launched in the Techno showroom shortly. Norman, thank you for illuminating cycle tour around your career. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
May I ask a question? I have a question for you. I think it's better if I come over here. Does it work? So you mentioned the example of Nomos of 87, the fact that this experience with Foster came at a time the office world was dramatically changing because of the arrival of computers. Now we are in another moment of great change in the office world. We are being presented with a project not only by architect Foster, but by the Norman Foster Foundation and Research Center. What's going on? What's in store in the future of Techno? Is there one additional step into the evolution of the office world? Well, you know, we've certainly made important steps and leaps. As I think most of you know, we've always worked in workplaces, and workplaces, as we were saying before, have changed as a function of technology. The first time a bench was made, that is the possibility of working in a community compared to a single desk, was created right here, not even here, in fact, at the Triennale for the first time with white furnishings. Then, as I said before, came the invasion of computers on the desks, the tables, and then the need to really make layers. Then there was the PC revolution and the digital disruption, as if the physical space had essentially no future. I believe that along with digital spaces and digital work, the workplace remains consistent and well-defined. Norman before stressed how important some of these objects are in terms of touch, of first intention, right? A few weeks ago, we were discussing with Annie. It's been 70 years since Techno worked with Enrico Mattei to choose the products, the desks, the situations that have been characterized in the world. So let's say that this kind of activities is where man needs to connect. Maybe we're now discovering what microarchitecture is about. How come meeting rooms somehow converge in a square? And in this logic of connectivity, to some extent, we Italians have a long-standing experience there. The square is one of the activities where you basically go back to work with different skills. And this is the rationale. The challenge of today is to go back and make a family of products and to be obsessed with quality, to find possible simplifications, to reflect on what sustainability is about, well beyond sometimes the idea of recovery, but using materials, the minimum amount of materials, working with quality. I think this is the most important element. This is a true challenge. Almost 40 years have passed since Nomos. Well, it's not an exaggeration, but it's his fault alone for choosing the name Cosmos, so a much larger dimension than was thought simply 40 years ago. Okay, thank you.
Ok, se non ci sono cose vi aspetto tutti in Piazza 25 Aprile.
Okay,
Una scoperta
I'll
che
see
vale
you
la
all
pena
in
fare.
Piazza 25 Aprile, a discovery worth making.